Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education, or an episode with a guest or multiple guests. In this week's particular episode with Arya Chernik, we discuss student-centered engagement situated within authentic contexts, problems with focusing entirely on capitalistic purposes of education, using critical pedagogies to problematize power dynamics in the classroom, using an open design for learning, the phenomenology of collaboration, creating a space that encourages taking risks in education, and much more. As always, you can find these show notes at jaredoleary.com or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, and it'll take you to the resources, podcasts, and other content that's related to this episode that we mentioned. In addition, if you check out the menu at the top of the show notes, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including well over 100 more other podcast episodes with some really awesome guests and some really cool papers that are discussed. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Arya.
I'm Arya Chernik, Associate Professor of the Practice at Duke University. I'm in the Social Science Research Institute and the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative, and I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Open Design Studio at Duke.
Can you tell me a story about an experience in education that continues to impact you today?
So when I was a grad student and I got my PhD in literature, I was teaching actually, as few grad students do. And I had a professor who was our mentor in our pedagogy class, and she came in to do what she called a teaching critique. So she would watch me teach a class and then give me feedback. And so she came in and she watched me teach a Comp Rhet class, and then we made an appointment to go over it. And the whole time she was, what I thought was writing notes. And when we had our appointment and we went over it, she showed me what her notes were, and it was she had just been drawing. And she drew my desk and where I was and where students were and how many times certain students raised their hand and what the gender of those students were. And what we talked about was power in the classroom and hierarchies in the classroom and what the space of the classroom was like and whether it was or was not conducive to learning. That was right when I started my PhD, and it really brought home to me how something even like, am I sitting or am I standing, can impact the learning environment. And I think about that to this day.
Yeah.
The second story is much more recent, and a handful of years ago, I started teaching really deep project-based work at the college level at Duke and started working with students on a project called CS by Us. And what I found is that even when the semester ended, because it was an ongoing project, I realized that students kept working on the project and they weren't getting credit and they weren't getting paid any kind of research assistantship. They were so committed to the project and they wanted to see it through. And these students are so overbooked, overscheduled. And the fact that I had all these students continuing to work on the project for no credit, no money, because they really cared, that's when I said, okay, something is working here.
Let's jump off of that. What was working there? Why do you think that resonated so well with the students?
Oh, there's so many reasons. I think that we were addressing an urgent real world need. So in this case, it was creating what we started referring to as justice-centered computer science curricula at the elementary and middle school level. In particular, the justice-centered aspect of it was that it was designed to engage all students, particularly female students and students of color, to be engaged in computer science. And they were so committed to that. It was truly student-centered work. So we would identify the challenges. They would go through iterative phases of creating curricula at different iterations of the project. Sometimes they were teaching it because we started in after-school programs. They would create the curricula. They would teach it in after-school programs. Eventually, we started doing it in school. And so then obviously the teachers were teaching it, but it was so real. It was so tied to something that they were passionate about, and it wasn't just reading about it. I mean, they really made an impact in the Durham community in an authentic way. It wasn't just, often we hear about like civic engagement and students do it for a semester, and that's great. There's a lot that's good about it, but there's also a lot that's problematic about it. And I think these students really felt that they were authentically engaging in the community.
Yeah, I like that. Even if it's like authentically engaging in something they are interested in, not necessarily having an impact outside of the walls, but having an internal impact on what they're working on. I've found that students will just go home and just like, they won't stop working on it. And it doesn't matter what age it is, whether it's elementary kids that I worked with or even some of the college students that I've worked with. Like one stands out in particular. There was a final paper where it was like kind of choose your own adventure. What do you want to write about that synthesizes what you learned in this class in what you're doing? And there's this one student who made it very clear from day one. The reason why he was in the class is because it would be an easy A. It was like a critical thinking in the arts class and for undergrad, and he thought it'd be the easiest class he could take to get an A and boost his GPA. And so when they got to proposing their final papers, he proposed something that was basically elaborating on the last project that we just did, and he had clearly like demonstrated he wasn't interested in it. And it's like, I sat down with him and it's like, what are you actually interested in? And how often have you been given the opportunity to explore that interest in a way that you can get credit for it? And you're going to just synthesize what you learned, but in something that you actually are passionate about learning more about. And the student was like, honestly, I've never had anyone ask me that before. And so he went home and thought about it. And he ended up writing this paper on how the music that he listens to when he's working out is very different than the music that he listens to when he's not working out. And he went into this like power dynamic relationship saying like, I realize that my music is extremely misogynistic, is all about hurting people and hurting women and abusive, etc. But that's not who I am as an individual. But for whatever reason, it really pumps me up. And he had this like breakdown analysis and like went like full into this. And it was because he was exploring something that he's interested in. So I say all of that to say, yes, this totally resonates. When you finally give people the opportunity to explore something they're passionate about, like they'll run with it.
Absolutely. And I actually think one of the most important things we need to do in education innovation is find ways to give credit or to credential what students are doing outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
Not only because it pulls that passion in, but because it allows them to reflect on it and deepen their interest and their love of it, and to make connections between what they're doing outside of the class and what they're doing inside of the class. And learning now, it's all the time. It's literally happening all the time. And to not acknowledge that just is another brick in the wall of how kind of far down the road in education we've gone that's out of touch with what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, but the way that you've just phrased it and the way that I phrased it is very different than the discourse that's going on, especially in this CS education space. Like I watched a conference recording a couple weeks ago where the person was just basically saying the only point for education is to get a job, and specifically a job in CS. And I was like, there's so much that like you're missing here. Like so many things about lifelong learning, about like mental health, about social health, physical health, like all these things that you're completely ignoring just in favor of jobs. And I find that extremely problematic when we like really kind of go this tunnel vision route with education where it's only focused on getting a career. Yes, it's important, but it's not the only thing we should be focusing on. I mean, look at all the conflict that we have in the world right now. How about we also try and find some ways to resolve that, not just make money?
How about that? And in fact, I would venture to guess that very few students have been asked, what do you think the purpose of your education is? What do you want the purpose of your education to be? And especially when they start paying for their education and, when they're in post-secondary, what do you want it to be? How do you want it to be? What is the purpose for you? I mean, they're paying for it. It's their education.
Yeah, my thoughts on this have changed over time. One of the things that I like to do is think about, like, when I first started teaching, how has that idea or philosophy changed from now? So for you, I'm wondering, when you first started working in education, what's something that you believed that you no longer believe?
When I first started working in education, I believed that transforming our system of education would transform the world. I still believe that. most of the time. However, it is very, very hard sometimes when you hear and you see what's happening in education day in, day out, to keep that belief, to keep that like flame lit. So there are times, and they are still fleeting, where I don't believe that we can change education. But again, hopefully they will remain fleeting, because I still do believe that that is our best chance to make the world a better place, just as you said. I mean, it's all about education. It's all about critical consciousness of the world. We have an opportunity to create the world we want to live in. That's through education.
So, what is something that we can do about this to address something that might be holding back educators or the field?
Yeah, when I think about this kind of question, my mind often goes to, we need to collaborate more. We need to collaborate across sectors. We need to change, for instance, funding structure. So much of the funding that in higher education we get is for what would be considered kind of traditional research. And that's very different than, now there's a lot more, but it's still very low emphasis on things like research-based design or participatory research. But that, in my mind, especially in the field of education, that is what will really change things, because researchers cannot do it alone. Teachers cannot do it alone. It is too big of a problem. So until we have funding and we have time and we have all the things that we have for other kinds of research and development projects, until we really start thinking about educational change and innovation as a research and development project, I think it's going to be very difficult to change things, because it's a problem that has been with us for hundreds of years.
So I'm curious, how might critical pedagogies fit within addressing that?
Well, I think that's one of the answers, if not the answer. To me, critical pedagogy is about teaching as critical consciousness, teaching and learning as critical consciousness, as liberation. So understanding the normative systems of oppression that were built in by design into the education system, and how we can break those and build something up. That's how I think about critical pedagogy. And that's exactly what I was just saying, that from my perspective, we need to do. So I think if we approach education innovation through the lens of critical pedagogy, we're hugely ahead of the game, because we're already questioning and trying to disrupt and to break those systems that have been in place for so long, that are not only not serving students, but are prohibiting innovation.
Can you double click on what you mean by oppression that's built in by design, like provide an example?
So the way I think about it is, the education system that we have by design was created for standardization, and it was created for surveillance, and it was created so that every person learned an identical thing in the identical way. But the problem is, even though we said every person, it really wasn't every person. It was very much for white males, who were the people who were going to school and being educated and then going off. And if we look at the system of education that we have now, that's very reminiscent of what was designed in the industrial era in Britain. It was going off to kind of serve the British government in the British Empire. And that obviously looks extremely different than the kind of education that we need and deserve today. And there is so much research about, for instance, students of color and male students of color being suspended and disciplined at much higher rates, disproportionate rates, than their white counterparts. In computer science, it's the same thing. What I find fascinating is that even when access to computer science education is available, students of color and female students still don't take advantage of that access, because that access usually happens in high school with something like AP computer science courses. But we need to start letting female students and students of color know from their first school experiences that that kind of thinking and creating and doing is for them. It can be a part of who they are in the world if they want it to be. And that's not what we see when we look at the world now. Those spaces are occupied by white males predominantly.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I love working in the elementary space is it's like, hey, let's explore things that you're interested in and everybody can do it. And it decouples it from that relationship with AP. Specifically, the first class that I took on programming was an AP class. It was the only programming class that was offered. So if you weren't like going the AP route, like if that wasn't of interest to you, why would you want to take a programming class? Like it needs to be, yes, you can keep the AP, but you need to have something separate from it because that way you can get some people who are interested in maybe programming or CS or whatever, but don't necessarily want to go that college track route.
That's exactly right. So that's like you just gave this wonderful example of something being by design, right? So like these AP courses are designed to kind of accelerate the difference between one type of student. And so unless we start changing those structures, changing the narrative of who can be a successful learner in the early years, it's too late by the time they get to high school.
So hearing you talk, like I am imagining a variety of influences that I happen to be aware of, but I don't want to necessarily like throw out some names and be inaccurate with that. So I'm curious, how did you learn about critical pedagogy? And then how does that kind of inform how you teach or model critical thinking or critical pedagogies?
Certainly. So I learned it in grad school from people like, for instance, this professor that I mentioned who came to watch my teaching. But I learned it in a lot of different ways. First of all, I learned it from being a student. And the wonderful thing is that most people have been students in some kind of formal education. And there's this tremendous wealth of knowledge about what experiences are. So I learned it from being a student. I certainly learned it when I went to grad school, when I was, learning teaching, but I also learned it a lot actually in like through my PhD in literature, through the philosophy courses that I took, because my concentration was in 1790s British literature, but it was also in critical theory and philosophy. Two of the philosophers that I studied deeply were Derrida and Levinas. Derrida and the theory of deconstruction, and Levinas with the theory of ethical hospitality. Both of these theories are very much about how to be in the world and how to be with others. And I found them deeply applicable to teaching, thinking about the classroom as a space of ethical hospitality has been really influential for me. And then, of course, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Freire was probably the most important text in terms of my thinking about critical pedagogy, thinking about teaching as liberation and critical consciousness.
What about on the power and surveillance side of things, like Bourdieu and Foucault, or?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly. This idea, of course, of the panopticon, I think has been really influential. And of course, like this, discipline and punish, the title of Foucault's, one of his texts. I mean, that feels so much like the anti-ethical hospitality and so much like what happens in schools. Like that is so much the way schools feel. It's about, discipline and punishment. And that's not a learning environment. It's just not. It might be a great environment for discipline and punishment and a great environment for confining knowledge, for stabilizing knowledge, but it's not certainly a good environment for creating knowledge or challenging authority, challenging the status quo. And that's what education should be about.
So I'm going to attempt to weave together many things that you just said while also elaborating on panopticon in case people are unfamiliar with it. So panopticon, think of like a tower cake. So like a big cylinder, and on the outside of that, we have all of these cells in this prison where the prisoners are all at. And they're able to look towards the center. And in the center is a tower where people can observe you. So standing guards will stand in that center of that tower, and they can look out anywhere and see everything that's going on in each one of the cells and whatnot. And this goes for all the different floors. And that kind of surveillance has like a real psychological toll on people when you're constantly being monitored and watched. But if we think of back to what you were saying at the very beginning with like the professor who was observing you and was drawing and looking at the power and where you were standing, etc., the way that people will often design a computer lab in particular is set up like a panopticon. Where the teacher stands is where they can see every single screen all at one moment. And so like how you set up your space has an impact on the ways that people can engage, the way that people can converse, because you are setting it up for that panopticon relationship, that power dynamic, as opposed to setting up for, hey, let's set this up in like groups or pairings or like tables that are all kind of facing each other so that you can encourage collaboration and communication, etc. So like the spaces that you have has an impact on the ways that people interact, which has an impact on the ways that you can facilitate, etc. And they all kind of like relate together, etc., in ways that create these power relations that can occur in classrooms. I don't know if that kind of summarizes some of the things and ties things together.
100%. It is so true. And this really can't be understated. So, for instance, my class is so much about challenging that power dynamic, and I'm a co-learner with students. And I thought we reserved this wonderful space on Duke's campus because it is a kind of maker space and it had the feel that I thought would be great for the class. And of course, with the pandemic, we can't be close together. Everyone's in masks. It's a big kind of cavernous space, so it's hard to hear. And so the first day of class, I had to be on mic. And it was like exactly what I didn't want. I was literally in the front of the class on mic as if I was giving a TED talk. And it was so not what I wanted. And so luckily, we've kind of like hacked our way through it and we have a different space for next semester, but it embodied that idea of this is not the teacher that I want to be. I was performing literally the sage on a stage, and it was so counter to the environment of learning that I work so hard to cultivate in our classroom. Like words are really important. And so often we say my classroom as teachers, and I'm really consciously trying to alter that because it's not my classroom, it's our classroom, it's our learning environment.
Yeah, I wish people thought more about the potential impact of words. Like in the opening videos that I make for Boot Up, I always start with "Welcome back, fellow coders," and it was very intentional with the wording that I was using. I was saying fellow because I was saying I'm a programmer, but you are as well, and trying to like get people to understand that, hey, you can do this thing. But then like even when I was in the classroom, I had a business card that instead of saying like music educator, music teacher, it'd say facilitator, music facilitator. It's because I was trying to account for the fact that, yes, I was designing the space in terms of like the physical layout, but also the curriculum, but it was a co-design, and I was facilitating the learning experiences while I was learning from kids, while they were teaching each other, and while I was teaching them. So it was like trying to account for all the different kinds of engagement that was going on. And for me, facilitator like kind of more aligned with that, but maybe I'm overthinking it.
I don't think so at all. I think that it would improve our education tremendously if more people thought about words. I actually think words are extremely important.
Yeah, I agree. So I also agree with critical pedagogies in the classroom. But one of the things that I like to think through is, well, when would you not do this thing that you really strongly are passionate about? So for you, when don't you use critical pedagogy?
Yeah. So I think of it as a continuum. And I believe that I always am a critical pedagogue in the sense that I believe that I always use critical pedagogy. That doesn't mean that sometimes I don't have to give a lecture about content, for instance. Unfortunately, I have to give grades.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly there are ways to mitigate the power dynamic that is so entrenched in assigning grades. However, I still have to assign grades. So when I say I am always kind of engaging in critical pedagogy, it's not that sometimes I don't have to simply transmit knowledge in a lecture, for instance. I think that's not being a critical pedagogue if that's all you do all the time.
Right.
I think, my kind of roundabout way of saying this is I think that if you're constantly reflecting on your teaching practices and iterating your teaching practices to meet the needs of the students, as you just were talking about, then I think that is critical pedagogy.
Yeah, I like that response. It reminds me a lot of, I did an Unpacking Scholarship episode on a paper by Rogalski, who describes something called methodolatry. And it's where you buy into a method so much that you ignore all else and you don't necessarily understand maybe why you are doing the method that you're doing. So if you're like, oh, I am 100% critical pedagogic, I will not do anything else, then that might be a form of methodolatry. Another version that we've seen is like constructionism. Like I am a full constructionist, or like I will just give kids a tool and then they figure it out. Like I will never do direct instruction. Like, so he warns against that, which is why I have mentioned several times in the podcast that I prefer to like think of myself as a multi-perspectivalist. So depending on the context, I will bring in a different perspective or in a different approach to meet the needs of the kid that I'm trying to work with. And it depends on who I'm with, where it's at, what time of day it is, etc. Like it always changes. Even though I'm like heavily influenced by critical pedagogy, there might be a moment where I will focus on something else or use basically like a different lens to approach the situation.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I know that a common misconception is that something like being a facilitator is easy or like hands off. And it's actually,
right.
I mean, I can't think of anything that sounds kind of easier than direct instruction, right? Especially if you're doing it semester after semester. I mean, there's like a bit of a running joke with my colleagues, and they're like, oh, I guess you're teaching a new class again next semester, but yeah, I am. I am. And sure, it would be so much easier if I taught the same class using direct instruction semester after semester and could kind of autopilot it.
Yep.
But I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, it's not intellectually stimulating. I don't feel like it necessarily does a service to the students, but that's my own kind of bias on that. I'm wondering if we could take a look at like some of your own research interests and like the classes that you have done and whatnot. So could you elaborate on what does open design and knowledge mean to you?
Yeah, I'd love to. So open design is a equity-centered innovation methodology that I've been developing over the last handful of years. It's deeply influenced by open source principles, in particular, active inclusivity, transparency, and collaboration. It's heavily influenced by design thinking, human-centered design, although the way those terms are used and the way those practices are used, I think there are some deeply problematic aspects of it. So my calling it open design and changing the process is my attempt to try to mitigate some of what I see as problematic about those processes. And then it's also really deeply informed by this idea that we talked about before about ethical hospitality. So it's a method of really research and development that asks the people with whom you're designing to be at the center of that process. So instead of, for instance, going out and interviewing people, we hear so much in a traditional design process about interviewing users, and everyone's a user. And it goes back to what we talked about before. It's actually a terrible term, user. It's something that I really dislike. No, they're co-designers, there are participants. So open design, the way we conceive it at the Open Design Studio, it's 4 iterative phases. The first is understanding, where we empathize and define. The next one is create, where we ideate and prototype, evaluate, where we test and iterate, and then communicate, where we connect and reflect.
If somebody were listening to this and they're like, this sounds really cool, but how do I do this in my classroom? Like, how do I design or teach or facilitate in such a way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been using open design in all of my classes. So, for instance, actually this year, I'm teaching a 2 semester course called Participatory Solutions for Human Flourishing. And we're using the open design process to look at really complex problems that have prevented people from flourishing across different social sectors. So I'm leading an education sub team, and we're looking at the problem of computer science education and the disparity in gender and students of color participating in computer science. So we're working with our teacher co-designers. So we've identified elementary school teachers in the community who are helping us co-design. We go through most of the first semester, which is coming to an end, has been what we call understanding the problem. So this real deep empathy work to understand what are the hopes, desires, and needs of the community. And then we define the problem, and we've kind of moved into the create, where we ask the question, what are radical ways we can build? So it generally is very project based when we talk about using open design within an educational context. I've used it, for instance, to think about education innovation, where the project looks at different pressing challenges in education, and then teams of students, it's of course very collaborative, go through the open design process to co-create solutions to those pressing challenges. It's very difficult because we try to be authentically engaged with our co-designers in the community, and that can be really difficult because the semester ends, right? And that's a different time frame than people who are not on an academic schedule operates under. As students leave, right? Like they leave the class and then they're new students. So there's a lot of logistical complexity that comes with doing really student-centered, deeply project-based open design in courses. But I have found it to be so engaging for students. It really allows them to create knowledge in ways that they rarely have an opportunity to do so in traditional educational contexts. They really are the kind of drivers of what they're creating, what they're learning.
So the thing that you're saying with like the semester not necessarily aligning with like what's going on in the community, it reminded me of a professor that I had who was saying, well, what do we do about the student who takes, let's say, 12 weeks to learn something and be extremely like A+ at it, like one of the best, but the class is only 10 weeks long. So 12 weeks and they're fantastic, but at the 10-week point, that's when you have to provide that summative assessment. That here's your grade, and then you leave. But then thinking of what you're just saying, like combining that with some of the models that I've seen with some community colleges in particular, where they have like a rolling start, where like every like 3 or 4 weeks, you can start a new class, but everybody who starts in that cohort all kind of goes at the same time. And I'm just kind of thinking out loud of a thought that I'm having is it might be interesting to have that rolling start, but they go into a class that is already existing where people are going across it in different ways and they kind of overlap from beginning, middle through end and whatnot, and being able to like collaborate in the discussion. But I don't know what that would necessarily look like. It would need to be very rhizomatic as opposed to linear. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud. This might not make sense.
I love it. It makes total sense. And it's exactly the question that my colleague Kevin Hoke and I, the co-director at the Open Design Studio, and I are working on and trying to figure out in terms of how to move forward with this kind of learning at Duke. The pacing of the semester does not feel conducive to learning. So that's exactly what we're trying to figure out, is how we can have a pacing that's more kind of intense learning together, and then being able to go out and do the work and apply and experiential learning. And that's going to take place at different paces and in different ways, and then kind of come back together and continue that learning. So the pacing looks quite different. And that's exactly what we're trying to figure out, is how to do that so that while some students are kind of offboarding, other students are onboarding.
Yeah, I'm interested to see like 5, 10 years from now, like what that will look like. So one of the things that caught my attention, I think, was when I was reading your bio. So you mentioned in it the phenomenology of collaboration. I'm curious, when exploring that, what might surprise educators about the phenomenology of collaboration?
Yeah, so this obviously shows my interest in training in philosophy. So often we think of collaboration as group work, but that to me is not the phenomenology of collaboration. To differentiate it, group work feels like divide and conquer. It's more of that almost like discipline and piecemeal and very exacting. It feels surface and like everyone go off, everyone do their part, and then we'll come back together and we'll, cut and paste it all into one. There are four of us on the team. We'll take four documents and we'll cut and paste into one document. And that feels very like a collage. And to me, when we talk about the phenomenology of collaboration, we're really talking about co-labor, like collaboration. It is creating work together that could not have been done unless everyone was there, bringing their own selves, their own lived experiences, their own knowledge to the work, to the project. It's not, divide and conquer is, oh, great, we can get it done in a quarter of the time. So it's not about cutting it up and dicing it up. It's actually about organic creation together. And it's about creating a space where we can all do our best work, we can do our best learning, we can do our best creating. And that's hard. And that takes time to create that space of ethical hospitality. To me, the phenomenology of collaboration is about creating a space of ethical hospitality within the classroom so that that collaboration can happen. And that kind of space is critical for the open design process, because for open design to work, you have to be able to contribute ideas in very nascent stages. And that can be really difficult for students who have been trained to not take those kinds of risks, who have been trained to polish everything, who, for whom knowledge has to be presented at the end of a process, not all the way during a process. And so it can be really difficult. It can be difficult in particular for students who have excelled in traditional learning environments.
Yeah.
Where they've been really rewarded for not taking those kinds of risks and for not having really divergent thinking patterns. The traditional education is much more a convergent thinking process.
I'm glad that you kind of teased out that nuance, that consideration, because I've had a lot of students that I've worked with across the entire grade span where they're uncomfortable when given the opportunity for choice. They'll often respond with, yeah, but what do I need to do to get an A? It's like, that's not the question that I hope you will ever ask again in this class. That's not the point of this. The point is for you to be able to learn something, but it's so against what they have been trained literally to do for sometimes over a decade that it's uncomfortable for them to think outside of anything but that.
I mean, it really is punished with grades. And, for a lot of these students, the difference between a 99 and a 97 has real consequences. And it's a lot to gamble with. So I love seeing what happens when we create a space where students can learn how to take these risks. And I mean, it's an overused word now, but be resilient in the face of ambiguity. It's so important because that's life. I mean, that's what life is. It's being resilient in the face of ambiguity. A mentor of mine put it this way, and it's stayed with me for a long time. When a child is learning to walk, when the child first stands up and takes a first step and falls, we do not say, oh, this child failed. Oh, this child can't learn to walk. We say this child is learning to walk. We celebrate it. We laugh, we clap, we do all these things as the child learns to walk. And unfortunately, in education, we don't build in that runway. We don't provide spaces and time to learn how to learn and to learn in ways that are messy and ambiguous and really, really creative. It's so linear and it's so standardized and it's so against our basic human and humane instincts, which is we need to fall down. That's how we learn to walk.
Yeah, and we punish when the mistakes happen. Like my parents went to pretty strict schools growing up, and they would literally were hit with rulers if they got an answer wrong. It's like, what is that training you to do long term?
Right. That's exactly right.
So I'm curious, how do you iterate or practice your own abilities as an educator?
Every day. So I'm always a learner. And in that sense, I'm always practicing. I co-construct courses with students so that in that way I'm learning. A lot of the reflection that I ask students to do is actually about their learning experience and what I could have done to make it better, what I can do to make it better. You know, you mentioned like this question's going to be meta a few minutes ago, and I feel like I teach meta. So it really is a recursive process. I hope that the best way that I iterate as an educator is by creating a situation where I and the students can have that kind of open dialogue where I can ask for that feedback and get authentic feedback without fear of being punished, as we've been talking about, especially in the form of a lesser grade.
Yeah, so I'm going to share this with you in the chat, and then I'll post this in the show notes as well. But if anyone hasn't listened to the Rhizomatic Learning panel discussion that we did, it definitely relates to what you're talking about with co-constructing a class. So going into it not knowing in advance necessarily where you're going to go. You might have some landmarks of where you might want to end up, but you don't know how you're going to get there and the path and whatnot. So I highly recommend people check that one out.
That is 100%. We have what we call a live calendar in our courses. So it's what we've been talking about. There's scaffolding there, there's structure so that students understand expectations, they understand kind of an overall trajectory and overall narrative of what we hope to accomplish, but they're driving the learning. So in that sense, we certainly don't know what the end product is going to look like.
I know for some educators that can create some anxiety, not necessarily knowing, and then that constant like iteration on oneself can kind of like decenter a sense of identity if it's just constantly in flux or in a state of becoming. So for you, coupling that with like just the general pressures of like being a professor and working in the field of education, how do you try and prevent the burnout that can come with that?
I actually find great beauty and energy in that idea of becoming. It's funny because I actually had a professor in grad school, and when we were talking about Derrida, he said there are two kinds of people in the world, you know, those for whom deconstruction kind of instills great anxiety, and those for whom it kind of inspires excitement, great deep passion and excitement. And yes, it's extremely difficult. And, you know, logistically, it's difficult, and it's difficult in terms of kind of scaffolding learning. But when I see what students create and when I hear what students say and reflections about their learning and what they will carry forward with them, that is deeply energizing to me. Those are my happiest moments as an educator. So, in terms of kind of maintaining health and well-being, certainly digging into those moments and those feelings. My mom used to say, this is a long time ago. One time I called her. I used to have a long drive from teaching, and so I'd often call her from the car. And one day we were talking and I was tired, and she said, you know, even when you're tired, even after you've had a long day, you always sound so happy after you teach. And like that stayed with me all these years because I'm happy when I teach. And then there's running and reading, finding a book that I can't wait to get back to at the end of the evening. That's hugely restorative for me, being at the ocean, So there are certainly things that I do to try to maintain balance.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. Thank you. So zooming out, what do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
I wish that there was more research on different kinds of research. I wish we had research about how to better measure some of the kind of attitudes of students. So often we use things like pre and post surveys. I mean, no one wants to take those. That's just terrible. It's like we have to have something better. I wish that we thought of research more as how do we capture what we talked about when we first started talking, like these students who come back and they want to participate in the course, even though they can't take it again for credit. Like, how do you measure that? How do you research what's happening there? I just haven't found good ways to do that. And so frequently funding is tied to research. And so if there aren't good ways to measure that, then it's hard to get funding to be able to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I think people also have a tendency of doing a methodology with research approaches as well. So there's a professor who, in music education, he was presenting at like a qualitative research conference. And from what I heard, I wasn't there, but the first statement that he said is, "Welcome to the first and hopefully the last qualitative research conference." And the point he was trying to get at was like, you shouldn't buy into just the method. You need to think of the question and then find a method that matches that. But then even in like PhD programs, some programs are like you take your qual class and you take your quant class and like that's it. And then you don't have anything else. Like I was fortunate that I had a historical research class. I also had like a teacher education class. And then I had a discourse analysis one. And that opened up my eyes to like corpus linguistics approaches, which is like this combination of like all these different ways to like analyze patterns of discourse and look at like millions of words of data and then specifically find out like what are they speaking about. And like that's rarely even talked about. Like most people don't even know about like corpus assisted discourse analysis. So I'm totally on board with that idea of, hey, we shouldn't just like do quantitative or just qualitative or just survey research or whatever.
Absolutely. And really, especially now, with big data being all the rage, qualitative research and talking to people, learning from people is not really well kind of resourced and funded.
Yeah. What's something that you're currently working on that it could use some help with?
I would love to find new ways to assess learning. So that's one thing I'm really interested in. Another thing that I'm working on is still within this computer science space. So one of the projects that I'm working on requires expertise from educators, expertise from computer science educators, expertise in terms of teachers who are needing to implement computer science standards into the, standard course of study. There are a lot of different stakeholders, and it's been difficult to figure out a way how to have that kind of collaboration. So I'm not quite sure if that makes sense, but it still puzzles me how siloed we are as educators and why we can't come together and why we can't work together to solve some of these problems. It seems like it's very rare that everyone you need is in the same place, kind of like geographically or even like in terms of a building. And so I feel like it would be wonderful to have a team of people from all over working on this problem.
Yeah, I hope that the remote work that's been going on because of COVID and then kind of like the increase in research practitioner partnerships, RPPs, I hope that that's going to help. So like I'm working on a project in Wyoming from Arizona, and we have team members from across the US who are all doing this in this RPP. And it's that coming together of voices, but there's not enough RPPs going on.
I agree.
Do you have any questions for myself or for the field?
I'm interested to know what you see as, kind of like, I don't like this word, but trends or things kind of like bubbling up in education innovation generally or CS education more specifically.
I guess one of the interesting trends, if I were to just kind of pick up on one of them, is there has been a lot more conversations around, well, what is project-based learning? And it's treated as a homogenous thing. Like, oh, well, if I'm doing PBL, that's the same as somebody else doing it in a different subject area across the country. And so we don't really, in the field, tease out those nuances of, well, what could it look like? And what's the continuum along project-based learning from a more open style project to a more close-ended or defined project that's defined in advance? And so it's been interesting, like hearing those conversations and then having some of the interviews on this podcast. Like one of them that specifically talks about this more that hasn't come out yet at the time of this recording is like, I wish more people understood the different ways of doing PBL. And so that, I guess, is kind of one that kind of pops to mind based on some recent conversations and sessions I've seen at conferences.
Do you know Ben Owens?
Mm-mm.
Oh, if you want to talk to someone who's like the most thoughtful person about this, I would get in touch with Ben. I'd be happy to introduce you. He's amazing.
Yeah, that'd be great.
He was a teacher for a long time, and now he has a consultancy called Open Way Learning, and he does a lot with open education and is deeply involved in project-based learning and is really thoughtful about it.
Yeah, I'd be happy for that connection. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, of course.
So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
So they can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn or Open Design Studio at duke.edu or email, and would love to talk with people interested in these things.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. Make sure you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com, where you can find links to connect with Aria, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I create 100% free coding curriculum for. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.